Good morning everybody, it's Chris again, and today what we're going to talk about is fitting one of these. It is a ball bearing unit and I'll explain how to fit it in just a second, but I thought before we did that I'd explain why you might want one. Here we have lovely powawalker, 2 motors connected by a single axle going between 2 motors connected together. Now the problem with this is twofold. One is that if you're going around corners and say this wheel, say you're turning in this direction, this wheel will skid and skitter as it goes round because this wheel is being driven further. And so you get this sort of noisy skittering noise. That doesn't bother me, it has to be said. What does bother me is that the reason I use a powawalker is because I do videos at pop festivals. And I use this for carting stuff around, and my environment is mud. I can quite often have mud going way past the axles. And if this motor, shall we say, locked up, let's say it's in some way locked up, it's seized up, it burns out, this motor will attempt to drag a dead motor around and it won't get anywhere. So you've now ended up with an overladen trolley, probably one that you probably wouldn't be able to carry, drag by yourself. So what we need to do is to separate the drive from this motor and this motor. And that's where this little beastie comes in. It is a very simple device. There's nothing clever in it. There's a bearing at this end and a bearing at this end. And so if what we do is to cut the drive shaft in 2, we now have 2 independent drives. This motor driving this wheel, this motor driving this wheel. So, here we go then. Let's do it. So the first thing to do is at minimum take off one wheel, which I'll do here. Here we notice the pin, the shear pin, and so what I'm going to do is to pop that out, which is always a bit of a fiddle, to be honest. There we go. We've got this end plate here with 3 screws. Just use an ordinary crosshead screwdriver and take those screws out. I've in fact already done it. Now we come to probably the only bit of specialist kit that you might need, which is a pair of circlip pliers. Because in here, holding this in position, is a circlip, so you use your trusty circlip pliers to take that off, which I'll do now. Okay, now what we do, quite simply, is you'll notice in this position there's a hex bolt. Just use a hex key, undo the hex key, and that then enables this collet to come forwards, drag that to the side, and you'll notice inside the famous ball bearing. What I tend to do is if you twist here, what it does is to pop the ball bearing upwards, which you can then grab hold of and put in your bag of bits. You then have to basically repeat the same operation on this side. So take out the hex bolt here with your hex key, take out the circlip here and remove the wheel. What we should now have is this rod, which is now able to move. I find that it's worthwhile just giving this a quick oil up beforehand. The rod tends to get a bit corroded in use, and you might have to use your trusty mallet just to give it a little tap, just to shock it to get it going. Once it gets that far, you should be able to pull it out, and there's the collet that I mentioned with the hex bolt in it. pull it out. Here it comes. And there we have the drive shaft. So what we need to do is to cut the drive shaft in half, but it's not just one cut. Let me explain that. As I understand it, there's going to be two versions of this device. One version will have a plate going through the middle of it. My version has simply got a bar going through it. I don't know whether you can see a bar in there. Anyway, the point is that when you make your cut, you need to make a cut that takes out a little bit of metal, I don't know, 2 or 3 mil in the middle there, to allow for the bar or the plate, depending on what version of the device you have. So what I will be doing is cutting this in half twice, cutting it once there perhaps and once there, and that then will make sure that when we put the bar back in, what we haven't done is to push the motors outwards like this. Okay, so here we are. I've cut the rod into 2, and I've made that extra little gap. The question is, of course, is my gap big enough to allow for the plate that's in here? We'll see how to test that in a second. Well, I'll do it now. So what you do is you put in the rod at one end, you put the rod in at the other end, you take the bearing unit, put it on, and push the 2 rods together into the holes at the ends of the bearing units. And then the crucial thing is that you may remember that here and here are the place where the ball bearing goes in, the little grub screw, and the collet. What you need to be sure is that you can line up by pushing backwards and forwards the axle drive. So I can see that I need to go more to the left there, to make sure that you can see the hole that the bearing goes in there and the hole that the bearing goes in there. If you can't see both bearings, you haven't cut off enough of the rod. One will line up, but one will be too far to the right or too far to the left. It actually took me about 3 goes to get it right, because my habit is to not cut off too much, to always try and cut off too little and then grind it down. And I would say it was probably ended up about 4 or 5 mil, including the cut depth itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fit this side completely so that that's done, and then we'll fit this side whilst you're watching. It's exactly the same, it's an exactly parallel process, but you don't want to watch it twice. So I'll get on and fix this side now. Hi everybody, so I'm back again and I've fitted the right hand side of the drive shaft. So I'm now going to do exactly the same on this side. So, you'll notice that I've already got the bearing on there. Don't have to, but it just makes life easier. Hold the collar, offer up the drive shaft, put the collar over the top of it, put the collar now, twist it onto the output from the motor, and then what we're trying to do, so I need to move that back so I can see what I'm doing, is just push it forwards. It will line up. The hole in the drive output lines up with the hole in the drive shaft. You then have to put the ball bearing in. Here's my bit of innovation for the day. Because I'm a fiddle fingers, what I did was to magnetise the end of my screwdriver. That means I can pick up small pieces with my big fat fingers. You wiggle the ball bearing down. You then use your hex key on the grub screw to tighten that ball down. So we'll put the collar over the top, it fits beautifully. Make sure that you're lined up, grub screw to ball bearing. That's it, that's beautiful, lovely and tight. We then simply push that bearing in there, and you will notice that the small indentation that the circlip is going to go into is now in the right place. So take your trusty circlip pliers and put the circlip on, pushing it into its groove. There it is, in its groove, absolutely fantastic, lovely. Then what you need to do is to put the shear pins into here. Basically just hammer that until it's proud equally on both sides. You then put your wheel on. So I'm going to hammer this on now, put the wheel on, and we'll give it a test fire. And what we now notice is that you can move one wheel, the other one doesn't move. You can move them in opposite directions. So you have got a really good setup. The trouble is that it's all a bit feeble now. I don't know whether you can see, but even with the best wheel in the world, this isn't great. And therefore the guys at powawalker have thought about that. And this comes as part of your kit. Now I've got to say, when this first turned up, I was really confused because it just seemed to be too long. I didn't quite understand where it was supposed to go, but I then worked it out. If you look at the motor gearbox protection plates, these things, you will notice that there is held on via a hex screw, a bolt on each side. And the same is true at the bottom. You probably can't see it, but it's down there as well. What we've got to do is to take out that bolt. Okay, so I've taken both wheels off just so that you can see what's going on. You'll notice perhaps that there's a hole here, which is where the original nut and bolt went. It went through there. The same is true here. So those have been taken out, as have the ones on the other side. So both have been taken out. I cut the rods, so this is how long the rod now is. Measured it up, cut it, and that's about the amount that I cut off. So it's not too much, a couple of inches. I cut down the plastic sleeving, and I in fact made it slightly too long, just by a mil or two, and that's the bit that I had left over. So now all we need to do is to test fit it together. So in through the hole there, in through to the other side of the gearbox. Push the plastic sleeving over the top. And into the end. And so now, already this is starting to become a lot more rigid. What you can then do is to put the nylocks on the end, at each end, and what you're trying to go for is to get everything lined up so that the wheels aren't either towing out or towing in. By having the plastic sleeving over the top here, that's actually pushing the back out, so the toes are going in like this. But because of the nylocks here on the long thread, I can bring them back in to location, back in line, and the whole thing is now way more solid. The whole thing is back to the same level of rigidity that you had before. So I will do that lining up process now, and then put the wheels on and we'll give it a last test. Okay, put the wheels on, and what I've done by adjusting the nylocks at the end of the threaded rod is to get the wheels absolutely straight. It's now really solid. I mean, it's as solid as it was before, even though what we've done is to cut through the main rod here. And you can see completely independent motion. So the bearing block in the middle is working. So there we go, and let's just see if it works properly. Yep, all looks good. Okay. I would think probably if I weren't videoing this process would have taken me probably about 2.5 hours. Anyway, I hope you enjoy it, and one of these days I'll show you this working in the muds of the festivals, fighting its way through the sticky toffee pudding, and carting way too much equipment from the main stage to the centre stage to the first stage and back again through all the mud. Okay, all the best. Cheers.